Hello, viewers, and welcome to another episode of the SAIPAR Podcast Drop series. On this special edition of the SAIPAR Podcast, we dive into the Drops project, whose acronym is described in the description below. This project is a SAIPAR project which is meant to advance access to electoral justice. On this series, we shall be having discussions in line with the project. Today, we'll be joined by Nicole Beardsworth, a researcher and lecturer of political studies at the University of Witwatersrand. She'll be joining us virtually for this discussion. Welcome, Nicole.
Thanks for having me. I'm really pleased to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So I'll just dive into it. So my first question is with regards to Zambia's current electoral system. They have, in fact, actually changed it. So do you think that, in a way, will affect the upcoming elections with regards to the new policies that are in place?
Certainly. The changing of an electoral system is always a major step in a country's democratic evolution. Electoral systems have an important role to play in promoting inclusion, representation, and conflict reduction around elections. As we know, elections are a kind of key moment when people get to choose who will represent them for the next 5 years. And in Zambia, this process has always held a particularly important place in the kind of public imaginary and in the relationship between the state and society. So these changes to the electoral system are really important and are really significant. And I think it really is important to unpack what these changes mean and how they can influence the electoral system going forward.
Okay. So looking at the current changes, do you think that any governance challenges that might arise from them?
Certainly. So thinking about the changes, the way these come about. So there was a change to the electoral system through Bill 7 in 2026, which then, once it was enacted, became Constitutional Amendment number 7 of 2026. And that essentially created a much larger parliament. So the parliamentary seats were increased from 156 to now over 280 seats in parliament. And in that design change, they also introduced some proportional representation system. So the PR system that was introduced includes 20 seats for women, 15 seats for youths, and 5 seats for people with disabilities. And so the intention is that this inclusion of 40 new seats, which are PR seats, that are included on the basis of proportional representation according to presidential election results. The idea is that this should increase the number of women included in parliament, the number of youth included in parliament, and the number of people with disabilities included in parliament. Of course, these design changes came very late in an electoral term, and the system that they were going to be using was also unclear until the very last minute when the Electoral Process Act was passed just before we went into the campaign period. So when we're thinking about some of the governance challenges that this creates, we need to think about uncertainty around process and uncertainty around procedure. And both of these things, I think, are important to flag right at the beginning ahead of Zambia's 2026 election. So when we're thinking about electoral system design, I think what's important to think about is two different types of systems. So PR systems, in which there's a party list, and the party chooses people on that list, and depending on how many people are on that list and what proportion the party gets in the vote, those people are then included as parliamentarians up to the proportion down the list, right? So party list systems. And then what Zambia has, which is a constituency-based parliamentary electoral system. And the constituency-based system has always been criticized for the fact that it leads to a kind of underrepresentation in parliament, because the directly elected parliamentary system for MPs means that if in a constituency 49% of people vote for one MP candidate and 51% vote for another, only the 51% who wanted the one candidate are represented in Parliament. The other 49% of the votes are wasted votes, essentially. With the PR system, the idea is that there are no wasted votes. All people who are included in Parliament are people who should have been included based on the national vote. But the downside of the PR system, which is what we have in South Africa, is that you don't have a direct relationship between people at constituency level and the parliamentarians. So there's a kind of breakdown in the representation system. So what we think of now as the best kind of electoral system is to have a mix of both PR and direct constituency election, which is now what Zambia is kind of moving towards, right? So now that we have in Zambia a mix of PR and direct constituency seats, we might hope that this will lead to an improvement in both inclusion and representation in the Zambian parliament.
Okay. So, what safeguards do you think are needed to ensure that these reforms, as been stated, the timing of them coming up, don't actually bring about conflict and actually meant to achieve the intended purpose?
So I think that the real risk here is just the very late way in which these reforms were brought in. So the fact that they were introduced right at the end of a parliamentary term, that many groups in civil society, religious groups, women's advocacy groups felt that there wasn't adequate consultation around these electoral system changes, and that the Electoral Process Act came into force just before the campaign period. So what that meant is that there wasn't adequate time for political parties to put process and procedures in place in order to make the most of these kinds of changes. So the trouble that we could perhaps expect is a kind of contestation over process, not necessarily over the fact that these changes may bring about an improvement in representation and inclusion, but that political parties and other civic groups didn't have enough time to adequately engage with the process in order to prepare themselves to maximize this new system of inclusion and representation. So I think the real problem here was the way in which it was introduced, not necessarily that it was introduced, but we might see some contestation over the fact that parties and other civic groups didn't feel adequately prepared because of the late way in which these changes were effected.
Okay, so are there any countries which you think have implemented a similar system? And are there any lessons that Zambia can learn from them?
So, what I think is really interesting is there's work by scholars such as Gretchen Bauer and Eiley Tripp, and the experience of women in neighboring countries like in Zimbabwe, which suggests that having PR seats, especially for women in parliament, is important. We need to increase Zambia's representation of women in parliament. For example, Zambia's highest representation of women in parliament was 18%. Zambia has never had higher representation than 18% for women in parliament. And as we know, increasing women's representation in parliament is one of the main reasons that was given as the justification for this change in the electoral rules. So what we would like to see is more women represented in Zambia's parliament. It has historically very low rates of female representation, And it's one of the lowest cases of female representation in the Southern African region, and even lower than the African average of 26%. It's, of course, much worse when we consider it alongside countries that have extremely high representation of women in parliament, such as South Africa, which has 45% female representation in parliament, and Rwanda, which has 61% women's representation in parliament. But really, in order for PR systems to adequately address the underrepresentation of certain groups, and women in particular, but I think youths and people with disabilities here is also important, they need to have adequate clarity around the rules for election and the roles and status of PR MPs. Because, of course, what we don't have at this point is any clarity on what the different rules and roles are for the PR MPs versus the MPs in the constituency elections. Of course, at the same time, having more women in parliament doesn't necessarily mean the greater representation of concerns that are specific to women. So in order for Zambia to have more substantive representation of women, we need to make sure that there are other reforms that surround this change in the electoral design. What we need to see is we would like to see more investment in women's caucuses, for example. So women MPs should have a specific place where they could go. They should have specific separate meetings. They should be capacitated to work on legislation that directly addresses the concerns of women. And they should be able to present a kind of unified voice in parliament that cuts across political party differences. And this isn't something that we've seen historically in Zambia, but it is the kind of thing that would lead to meaningful, substantive representation of women's interests in the Zambian parliament. And similarly, what we should also see is the increasing channels for women to bring their concerns to lawmakers and enabling women within parliament to raise issues that are of particular interest to women in society. And these things really are the kind of mechanisms that will make these PR seats more meaningful and the increased representation of women in parliament really substantive for changes in Zambian society. And then similarly, I think one thing that we really need to see is for these women parliamentarians to be enabled to go out and meet female constituents. So what we've seen in places like Zimbabwe is that when the PR system was introduced to introduce some female seats, so sort of PR seats for women, women in the party seats were then told that they weren't allowed to run in the mainstream constituency seats. They should run in only the reserved seats. So what this did was it increased contestation for women around the constituency seats, and they were pushed from there into these PR seats. Similarly, what we often see with these kinds of PR seats is that they're seen as kind of second-order MPs. They're not seen as being as meaningfully MPs as those that are directly elected. So there becomes a kind of a status problem when we see the introduction of PR systems, and it can lead to women being excluded from the mainstream constituency seats. So this also in some ways undermines the role of women in parliament, and this is something that really needs to be mitigated in the Zambian context. What I would like to see, and I think what most people who are concerned with elections and democracy would like to see, is these PR seats introduced alongside gender quotas for the mainstream constituency seats, that political parties should have to introduce quotas for their mainstream seats, and a series of mechanisms put in place to increase the capacity of women in parliament to actually form caucuses and to promote women's interests within the legislature.
So, Nicole, I'd like to draw attention to something that I think you've also seen in news every day about the new alliances, political alliances. It's like an everyday thing. So, do you think political alliances can be why are they a source of dispute before and after election?
So, political party alliances are really complex things. And it doesn't always seem that way from the media reporting. But essentially, my research, so my PhD was on the negotiation of opposition party alliances in 3 countries across a 20-year span. And what I found was essentially it is extremely difficult for political parties to come together in these alliances for a series of key reasons. One of which is that political parties are multi-actor institutions. And so what we see is when there are two parties which have their own parties, presidents, vice presidents, secretary generals, uh, chairpersons, and sort of on the organogram grows as you move down the party. And you have these two parties that both have these kinds of organograms. There is conflict over the collaboration at multiple levels because people feel like what is going to happen if they come into an alliance and that alliance goes into government is their position in the parties gets pushed down the line. So essentially what we see is because parties are multi-actor institutions, they can be conflict at every single level in terms of encouraging these two actors to collaborate and work together. So times when we see alliances succeed most is when you have one large party with quite a predictable voting base allied with much smaller parties with far fewer complex structures. So we might think about the UPND Alliance from 2021 as one of these kinds of coalitions, where essentially you have the UPND, which has a large and predictable vote base. It has a long record in electoral politics, allying itself with a kind of series of smaller groupings with a much less predictable vote base. So we might think of Charles Malupi's party here, the inclusion of Felix Mutati and others from what was left of the MMD, etc. So parties' coalitions are much easier to negotiate when there is more certainty around the likely outcome of the election, but also over these kinds of questions of the division of resources. So alliances often lead to disputes after the elections because there's a lack of clarity going into the elections about ideological differences. So sometimes there are quite meaningful ideological differences between political parties that are papered over before an election. They just kind of pretend that it's not there. And when they get into power, these differences over ideology, over policy, can create meaningful ructions in government. And we might think of an example of this in the current South African GNU, where the Democratic Alliance, which sees itself as a kind of liberal democratic party, and the ANC, which sees itself as a kind of social democratic party, have had a sort of series of ongoing disputes around questions like taxes, the management of the economy, and the management of employment equity and Black economic empowerment initiatives. In these cases, meaningful ideological differences that aren't actually addressed ahead of the election can become a serious problem in government after the election. And then the second thing that's often an issue is the distribution of positions and power. So when these parties agree to work together, they don't often outline, who is going to get what after the election should they end up in government. And so after the elections, what we often see is parties leaving the coalition because they didn't get the finance ministry or defense ministry or other positions of power. So these kinds of agreements can be quite difficult in the wake of an election if they haven't worked out the modalities of each before the polls.
Okay, so, do you think it would be beneficial to these alliances to have written agreements, dispute resolution mechanisms before they go ahead and make these alliances to avoid such disputes?
Definitely. So I would argue that alliance documents should be public documents, just like party manifestos. These documents should be public, they should have clear conflict resolution mechanisms, and they should have clear agreements on the division of power, kind of key baseline promises and joint policies, and a sense of where they expect potential divisions to come from. It's, of course, notable that in Zambia, the kinds of alliances that we're seeing at the moment are not the kinds of alliances that we've seen in South Africa, which are kind of entrenched political parties with clear identities and clear voting bases. In Zambia, the current system of alliance building has been much more fragmented and much more smaller parties allying with one another to try to kind of um, bridge some of the issues around access to finance, regional representation, and other issues that smaller parties are facing. So I do think that these alliance documents should be public, but we also often see a kind of difficulty around that comes from the necessities of trying to negotiate quite a complex process, as I mentioned, with these multi-level actors ahead of an election, which creates a time pressure, and often in a context where political parties feel like there are multiple options on the table. And so there's shifting series of alliances. And this sort of creates a lot of uncertainty in the process that leads to a lack of transparency and a lack of openness to the public. So I'm not sure we'll ever see these alliances make their documents public, but I think that is something that they should aspire to do. And it would hopefully help to undermine the post-alliance disputes that we so often see come out afterwards.
Okay. So, I would like to get your opinion on something. So, looking at the research that you've done with all these kind of alliances that you have seen, do you think uh, the alliances that actually succeed are those that are formed before an election, or the ones that are formed really close to an election? Which time frame do you think is the best for an alliance to be formed and to actually effectively succeed?
Well, that's a really interesting question because in my experience, the longer the amount of time to negotiate the alliance before the election, often the longer the runway for that alliance to break down. So we might think of the Pact Alliance from 2010 as an example here. So in 2010, ahead of the 2011 elections, the Patriotic Front and the UPND tried to come together to negotiate an alliance. What we saw in this case was two large parties with relatively predictable voting bases that were trying to come together to choose joint candidates, especially around by-elections, ahead of the 2011 elections. And what this generated was disputes at every level over the integration and the choosing of joint candidates, and also concerns about interference from the ruling party and interference from the state, which helped to generate kind of distrust in the process and distrust at multiple levels of these parties. What we saw is in 2010, the pact then collapsed. And ultimately, the Patriotic Front went into the elections in 2011 by themselves and won those elections. So when we're thinking about coalitions, it's often worth it to think about how long before the elections the coalitions should start to negotiate. Of course, what we've seen in this election in Zambia is those coalitions were the coalition negotiations started in around 2023. And there's been multiple rounds of coalition negotiation, collapse, and then subsequent coalition negotiation. And I think some of those parties would argue that we've seen again some level of state interference, some level of interference from other interested political groups in society. And so that does lead to all kinds of problems in the internal negotiations of those alliances. So it is a bit of a tricky question. How long before an election to organize an alliance? How long before the election to announce your platform? Because, of course, what the other problem is it leads to a lack of certainty for the voters. So voters feel like the process has been uncertain. They don't really know who the actors are who are involved in these alliances, and there's no predictability around what these alliances stand for and who's included. So, of course, it's a kind of multi-level problem that depends on timing and popular support and all kinds of things. So when we're thinking about successful alliances, I would say that most often the successful alliances that last are with one political party that is quite large and has quite a reliable vote base, and a series of smaller parties who bring smaller populations of voters to the table and smaller groups of representation. Those seem to succeed more often, but of course, it depends very much on whether or not there is kind of active interference from other political parties, interests, and groups.
Okay. So another aspect of these upcoming elections that I think you've also noticed is internal party conflicts. They're up and rising. So be it in an alliance or just generally in a political party, there's been a lot of internal party disputes. Do you think, to what extent do these contribute to actual electoral disputes if there's conflict within the party itself?
They've been enormous, and I think they're going to contribute to electoral disputes substantively and especially ahead of this election. So when we think about the kinds of disputes that have happened within political parties in this election, what we've seen is disputes within the opposition over who should be the opposition candidate. And that's been a kind of an open question for the last 5 years. And what we've seen is disagreement over whether a certain candidate should stand, and then the attempt to hold conventions, and then multiple conventions being held, multiple candidates being elected, and political parties splitting into various factions. And I think this is probably a sort of inevitable outcome of the kinds of fractions created in the wake of the 2021 loss by the former ruling party, the Patriotic Front. But also, it does tend to be the kind of thing that characterizes these kinds of party dynamics in the wake of a kind of change in the configuration of power of the state. Of course, electoral disputes are also occurring, and disputes over elections are occurring within the ruling party as well. We've seen quite extensive disputes over nominations, which has led to the standing of multiple independent candidates, especially in the ruling party's heartlands. And that, I think, is going to lead to kind of electoral disputes after the elections, because we have seen reports of allegations of sort of executive interference, allegations of multiple candidate nomination forms being given out, multiple reports of sort of intimidation of independent candidates. And so these kinds of internal party disputes are certainly going to drive electoral disputes in the wake of the election. And we can probably expect that there will be a higher number of these kinds of petitions of parliamentary elections in the wake of the 2026 polls. And this seems to be a function of these kinds of internal party dynamics, the management of nomination processes, the management of conventions, and increased competition for seats in the wake of the 2021 elections.
Okay. So, what do you think are some of the practical ways that these political parties can actually strengthen their transparency and accountability within their own parties? And do you think these actually have an effect on the voters in terms of who they pick?
Definitely think it has an effect on the voters because voters see the kinds of confusion that operates in the local level, and that contributes to confusion around who to support, over who the party prefers, over who the voters prefer. What I would like to see in general is political parties making their constitutions public and their procedures for nomination of candidates for election public, and then sticking to those procedures. Because what we see in every election, and perhaps is most exacerbated, most pronounced in this election, is that parties have procedures for the nomination of candidates, and they usually follow those procedures, which might look like primaries at the ward level, then constituency level, then the provincial level, and then finally the national level. But often those primaries and those selections that are done at each of these levels is overridden by the National Management Committee or the party's central organs. And it seems like in 2026, that was a process that operated more often than it has in previous elections. So there are always, in these cases, accusations of the imposition of candidates by party central committees that leads to disgruntlement at the grassroots level and disgruntlement within party structures. And this leads to kind of uncertainty around process, procedure, and unhappiness with the imposition of these candidates. So I do think that this has an impact on the voters because voters feel like there is a lot of uncertainty over candidates, nominations, procedure, and process. But also, it's likely to lead to a lot of splits at the local level and the kind of jostling between these independent candidates and party candidates that was produced by these kinds of fractious nomination processes. So I think what's important for parties is to make their rules public and to follow their rules consistently. But of course, this is something that we see in many cases that the rules are followed kind of inconsistently, and it depends very much on the central political interests within the party.
Okay. You spoke of making their rules public, and if it's alliance, making the agreement public. Do you think that makes a party a democratic party? And if there is such a thing as an actual democratic party, how does it look like in practice?
Definitely. I think that the more transparency and rules for accountability that exist within a political party, the more that party can be seen to be both internally democratic and externally democratic. So I think parties need to be thinking about how their rules promote greater inclusion of society and greater representation of society, at the same time as making sure that their rules and processes are predictable and reliable and followed reliably. One of the issues that we find in Zambia is that there's actually very little legislation that governs how political parties should look and should behave. The legislation that governs political parties is the Societies Act of 1957. And the Societies Act remains a piece of colonial legislation that governs all kinds of societies, not just political parties. So this act is very non-specific, and it doesn't really adequately provide for the important public role that political parties play. So I think what Zambia really needs is some more thoroughgoing legislation that governs how political parties should look, how transparent their procedures and process and constitutions should be, and helps to shape them in a much more democratic and transparent way. So, as you said, as you kind of mentioned, political parties are important democratic actors, and they should be behaving in ways that are democratic and transparent. And so I think making much more of their process and procedure public and publicly participatory would improve their democratic credentials, both internal democracy and their contribution to broader Zambian democracy.
Okay. So I'd like to shift your attention to the aspect of the citizens and their electoral knowledge. What do you think, or why do you think the citizens, the voters, the political parties having electoral literacy? What's the importance of having that?
Gosh, I think electoral literacy is so important. So, for voters to know and understand the procedures that govern them is absolutely fundamental, because citizens can only make use of their rights once they know what their rights are and those rights are actionable. So I think it's really important for political parties to invest in civic education and political literacy for the broader population. And of course, that's partly because political parties are the structures that exist on the ground across most of the country. So political parties are the actors that should be investing in this. But what we find is that because there is very little legislation that governs political parties, and there's no public funding for political parties often in Zambia don't perform this really important act. So political parties aren't investing in constitutional literacy and civic education of citizens outside of election times. And this is because political parties tend to be very inactive outside of election times because they don't have the kinds of finances to pursue a long-term political program that is needed for something like civic education. So instead, civic education is kind of tasked to civil society bodies and the Electoral Commission. And of course, both of them also face these kinds of challenges of being on the ground, being able to do it across the country, and financial challenges that this brings alongside it. But it is absolutely important that citizens be able to know what their rights are in order to action those rights, to know how they can make claims on MPs, on mayors, on the National Party, on the president, in order for those claims to be actionable. So, civic education is really important. How can it be strengthened beyond election periods? This is a question of funding and the reach of the institutions. So I think what I would like to see is much more thoroughgoing legislative change around the governance of political parties, perhaps the introduction of public funding for political parties that helps to ensure that political parties are some of the institutions that are doing this kind of civic education in between election periods. And that, I think, would be a really important and transformative process for Zambian democracy.
Situation where the citizens don't actually know their rights and their obligations, what consequences do you think can actually uh, entail on the democracy of the country and just in general?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think when you don't know what your rights are, it's very difficult to hold anyone accountable for what those rights should be. So, it's very hard to meaningfully action rights when you don't know what your rights are. It's also very difficult to meaningfully action your rights when you don't understand how the system of government functions and how it is put together. So I think it's really important that people know what their rights are and know what avenues are possible for them to try to action those rights. But I think in terms of civic education, it has to be more than just around the vote, right? The vote is important, but it's the kind of bare minimum of electoral participation and democratic participation that citizens can pursue. And actually, citizens should be able to engage with their parliamentarians and with other structures of the state in order to action their rights. Of course, this runs up against other kinds of challenges, access to justice in places where courts are overburdened, they're also underfunded, they are hard to access because they're in a district, they're quite far away from where people are. There's multiple layers to this, but I think we need to start with civic education because people need to know what avenues are available to them in order for them to meaningfully try to pursue those avenues.
Okay. So you spoke of the aspect of it being maybe expensive. That's why most parties and organizations don't do civil education. Do you think there are other practical ways in which we can actually implement letting the voters know their rights beforehand? Other something which is less maybe expensive, I guess.
Well, I think one thing that's important is integrating it into high school education. It should be something that is integrated into educational curriculums. And I'm not sure if that's the case. I haven't looked into this in any depth. But it's important to make sure that it's going on at the school level and then that curriculum is followed through for generations. So, of course, if we're educating students now who are only coming of age in 5 or 10 or 20 years, it's important that sort of pipeline is established and is maintained for the long term. That's probably the most effective way to do it, especially in a context where Zambia has just made free education legally binding. So now that all Zambian children should be able to go to school for free, we need to ensure that the curriculum reflects the requirements of Zambia's vibrant democracy, that people know how the state looks, how the state functions, and how they can action the rights that should be accorded to them from the Zambian constitution. But beyond that, I think we do need to make sure that other civic actors are engaging in this kind of civic education. So political parties, the media, civil society actors, and the Electoral Commission need to make sure that they are adequately reaching the population. And I do think that is a question of resources and making sure this happens outside of the electoral calendar, or throughout the electoral calendar, rather, over the course of the 5-year parliamentary term. But again, it is a question of resources, and we're in a context globally where resources are increasingly limited. So I think that investing in the education system would be one important way to effect these really meaningful changes.
So, just as a round off on the electoral reforms that we spoke of earlier, do you think there's an aspect that we haven't really discussed with regards to electoral reforms?
Um, Gosh, an aspect we haven't really discussed when it comes to electoral reforms. I think that what's really important here is that the 2026 elections are going to be a kind of test of these new systems. And we can expect there to be some hiccups given the ways in which these systems were brought in very last minute. And the Electoral Process Act, as I said, came into effect just before the campaign started. So political parties didn't feel adequately prepared, and civic actors didn't feel adequately prepared and there wasn't sufficient civic education around these changes. So we can expect that there are going to be some hiccups, there might be some litigation, and there might be some public disagreement over some of the sort of unintended consequences that come from these changes. My hope is that over multiple electoral cycles, the Zambian state and other institutions will invest in meaningfully making sure that these PR changes lead to greater representation of women, greater representation of young people, and greater representation of people with disabilities in Zambian politics. And that has a kind of meaningful long-term effect for the health and strength of Zambian society.
Okay. So as we wind up, do you have any thoughts or contributions with regards to the current electoral system, with regards to whether there are any changes that they can make looking forward and also currently?
So I think ahead of the next elections, what I would like to see, especially in terms of women's representation, I would like to see the introduction of political party quotas. So I'd like to see legislation that governs political parties, that is much clearer on what the public role of a political party is, that requires much more transparency and accountability from political parties, requires them to follow their process and make their process public, and also ideally allows for some level of public funding for political parties. Because the way that political party funding operates now is that there's no requirement for political parties to disclose where their funding comes from. And political parties who don't get funding from other politicians or business people don't have much access to funds. So that means that significant portions of the Zambian electorate are not represented adequately because certain political parties that might represent minority interests or minority ideologies are not adequately funded. So I think an important reform ahead of the next election would be to bring in new legislation governing political parties, requiring more transparency about those rules that they follow, public funding for political parties that also comes with a transparency requirement that political parties have to declare their sources of funding in order for Zambian voters to be able to make an educated decision about who that party represents and whose interests they might prioritize when they come into power. And then questions around how to meaningfully affect these PR seats and meaningfully ensure that women's participation in parliament and women's representation in society is radically reformed and improved. I'd like to see Zambia come up to at least the continental average of 26% female representation in parliament, but ideally to exceed that. Zambia has a long and proud democratic history. It's one of, I think, 5 countries on the continent who have had 3 turnovers of power. Zambians really believe in democracy and they really believe in their own democracy. And I think ahead of the next elections, I'd like to see those things strengthened. So more transparency from political parties, more investment in women's representation, and the broader strengthening of Zambian democracy.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's been an in-depth discussion today, and thank you for having made the time to join us and enlighten us on very different aspects of the election.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Well, viewers, that was another episode of the SAIPAR Podcast, special edition, the Sedgwick series. It was enlightening, and I hope each and every one of you has learned something new with regards to electoral justice and the electoral system as the elections are fastly approaching. See you next time.